Well, good morning, everyone, and welcome back to our series, our morning series on table fellowship. You'll recall that last time I spoke in the morning, we were considering Jesus' Last Supper. And we'll pursue that this morning. So this morning's episode is called Table Fellowship with Christ in the Upper Room. You'll remember that table fellowship is a word that refers to fellowship around a table, of course, and is sometimes called commensality. So if I use the word commensality, it's just another way of saying table fellowship around a meal. And last time, as I say, we began looking at Jesus' Last Supper in what appears to have been its chronological order according to the Gospel records. And we ended with a consideration of what I called the fourth scene of the Last Supper, the scene in which Jesus first mentions to the disciples that his betrayer is among them and eating with them. This first mention of the betrayer is depicted in two Gospels, Matthew 26 verses 21 through 25, and also Mark 14 verses 18 through 21. Here the meal is clearly in progress because Matthew and Mark both state that it is, as they were eating, that Jesus mentions his betrayer for the first time. Matthew and Mark next relate the response to Jesus' words by the majority of disciples and then by Judas, and in each case the accounts give Jesus' reply. We considered how important it was that Jesus made it very clear to his disciples that he was willing and prepared to have table fellowship even with a person whom Jesus knew to be a traitor. The lessons Jesus had given the apostles about table fellowship with his betrayer were things they needed to chew on as they continued with their meal. That they did, in fact, resume eating, as shown by Matthew and Mark's next verses, who used the same words now that they used in the previous scene. But the mood at the supper is presumably more serious and somber ever since Jesus mentioned a betrayer. Each apostle, Judas included, appears probably tense and anxious, but also, I imagine, more contemplative and more reflective than they were before. The minds of the 11 apostles, apart from Judas, must all be churning with the possibilities as to who is the betrayer's identity, and churning as well with the ramifications of what Jesus has said. There may be the odd individual still desperately searching his own heart as he asks himself, "Is it I?" Jesus will be watching and appraising them all before he mentions his betrayal again, as it will be recorded in Luke's Gospel and John's Gospel at a later stage. Meanwhile, as supper goes on, Jesus prepares to teach them another lesson around table fellowship. Now, on the table, there are loaves still unclaimed, and one of these will suffice to illustrate what Jesus had taught his disciples at other times, but which he must now impress upon them even more definitively at this, their final meal before his death. The loaves Jesus could choose from would be possibly like cakes in the form of bricks or stones, or they could be the pan-shaped loaves like naan or pita bread or pizza base. There are other loaves too, varieties that reflect the numerous ways that bread can be made. It makes no difference what shape the loaf was. Whichever loaf Jesus used though will be leavened bread. The Greek word for it is artos, meaning dough raised up by fermentation. Around the table, the disciples look pensive and distracted from still absorbing the bad news of a betrayer. They exhibit various emotions and behaviours in reaction to it, from probably being sullen and brooding as they pick at the food, to maybe agitated and restless as they busily keep working at their meal. As soon as Jesus reminded them this evening of his appalling belief that he would be betrayed to his Jewish enemies and be killed, sadness had washed over them. Now their melancholy is mixed with worry, distrust, anger and paranoia as they each become aware of and sensitive to the other disciples' suspicions and speculations. Obviously, those who were innocent of betraying Jesus would be wondering which of the other apostles it might be. But at the same time, they're becoming aware that those other apostles are starting to wonder about himself as well. There remains at least one loaf on the table among them when Jesus reaches over to take it, and with this simple action, Matthew 26 verse 26, Mark 14 verse 22, and Luke 22 verse 19, as well as Paul's words at 1 Corinthians 11 verses 23 through 24, now commence their four parallel accounts of what I've chosen to call the fifth scene. So Jesus took bread, or he took a loaf. Here the Greek word translated took simply means to take hold of. It does not imply Jesus received it from someone else. Somebody had not passed it to him, as happened in the case of the cup, which Jesus took earlier. Back then, Jesus had received the cup from someone else, according to the Greek word. But from here on, through the Last Supper narrative in the King James Version, the words take or took have this basic meaning of taking hold of a thing. And notice that this indicates that the taking of the bread and then after the bread of the cup again were done on Christ's initiative. He took them at his initiative, not because somebody had passed them to him. Matthew and Mark both say Jesus did this in front of the disciples as they were eating, or as they did eat, using the identical phrase they used for when Jesus first mentioned a betrayer at Matthew 26 verse 21 and Mark 14 verse 18. This means the meal was still ongoing and that the bread Jesus took was part of the food still being eaten at the time. Like everyone else at the table, Jesus will have taken the loaf from the same baskets or tray or cloth that they all took their loaves from. This was neither an extraordinary action nor an extraordinary loaf. At every other stage of the meal, what Jesus did would have gone quite unnoticed and gone quite unrecorded. So it wasn't an exceptional or singular or unique event. What caught the diners' attention was that Jesus then raised his voice to give God both thanks and blessing for the loaf. It would be a little bit like you being at home with your family, and halfway through the meal, somebody takes an item of food and then starts to pray. Or it would be like us engaged around the supper table after a meeting, and in the middle of it, you know, there might be a quiet time, and then suddenly somebody speaks up in prayer. Well, the apostles certainly admired the inimitable way that Jesus prayed, as Luke 11 verse 1 indicates. So Jesus had an attentive audience. They will have been particularly moved by the fact that although an awful sense of apprehension had come upon them since hearing of the betrayer, the Lord himself remained full of gratitude and praise to God. The gospel records indicate that he was giving thanks. He was expressing gratitude. Jesus was exhorting and encouraging himself with that joy set before him for which he was soon to endure the cross. By doing so at this time, he also helped to encourage and exhort the anxious disciples. Amid the hush, once he stopped praying, Jesus then famously broke the bread, gave the pieces to the disciples, and said to them, "Take, eat, this is my body, which is given for you. Do this in remembrance of me." It's not certain if Paul also quotes Jesus as saying, "This is the bread broken for you, is my body," or whether he said, "The bread is my body broken for you." It's not certain either whether the word broken refers to the bread or to Jesus' body. And it's not something we need to consider at this stage, but perhaps in a later talk. I personally think that it is unlikely that Paul referred to Jesus' body broken for him, but that is an arguable point. I believe more likely he was simply referring to the bread which was broken for them, which he likens to his body. Earlier, at the outset of the meal, Luke chapter 22 verse 17 recorded how Jesus had received a wine cup and then handed it over to the apostles and instructed them to share it between one another. Whereas now, at verses 19 through 20, this records that Jesus picks up the loaf and gives thanks for it exactly as he had given thanks for the cup earlier. But now, rather than hand over the whole loaf to the disciples as he had earlier done with the cup, he instead breaks the bread, that is, he tears it into portions and proceeds to give out the portions himself, personally, to the other people around the table. So Luke shows Jesus had let the apostles themselves share out the wine near the beginning of the supper, but Jesus later chose to share out the bread for them. Jesus may have done this by reaching across to each outstretched hand if the table was small and square enough. This seems most unlikely, though. If you can imagine the seating of 13 men in an approximate square, you'd probably agree that to have to reach across to each hand was unlikely to be easy. Instead, I think, Jesus apparently got up from the table and walked around it, handing a portion of the broken bread to each disciple where he sat. And when I say sat, you'll recall that they were actually in a reclined position. So they were lying on their side, propped up on an elbow in a fairly relaxed looking state. So Jesus is walking around them in much the same way as a restaurant waiter. This is evidently confirmed by what Jesus later says to them at Luke 22 verse 27. He asks, who is greater, the one who reclines or the one who serves? So he's making a distinction between those who were reclining and those who serve. He says, is it not the one who reclines? But I am among you as the one who serves. The service which Jesus spoke of was here, now, in the upper room, and the inference is plain that he had left his reclined position to serve out the bread and wine. His words certainly also related to the foot washing referred to in John 13, a connection which would have been clear at the time, but in the context of Luke's record, where Jesus said what he has just said, the context which led into verse 30 with Jesus' words about eating and drinking at his table in his kingdom, the object of Christ's service at verse 27 is not the foot washing, it's the meal itself. What Jesus is describing is much the same service which Joseph in Egypt served to his brothers when they came to dine with him. Now, this action by the Lord of intentionally, deliberately, purposefully serving the disciples is not a thing he had done at the supper before now. The cup he gave them at the start of the meal had been for the whole group. It was not for him alone. So upon accepting it from one of the householders or their staff, he had simply passed it to the apostles for them to share out. The breaking of bread is now the first time Jesus provided them with anything from the meal which, once he had laid hands on it, was then his to eat or drink. Offering the disciples what was in effect his own bread was something new this evening and was evidently not something that any of the disciples had done for one another. As Matthew 26 verse 26 and Mark 14 verse 22 clearly related it, the loaf was taken, broken, given, and then eaten while the meal was still in progress, which is to say, the broken bread was eaten as part of the meal. Back at his table place, Jesus resumed eating with his disciples as he had done hundreds of times over the past 3 years or so. Some of the men around the table eat their portion, perhaps wrapped around meat or fish or vegetables. Others scoop theirs into chutneys of minced fruits and yogurt, or into pastes of ground grains and legumes mixed in olive oil. And maybe someone eats some of the bread without any sort of relish, but he would be very unusual in doing so. Each man uses his last handful of the bread to finally sop up sauce or liquid. So we see that by giving them his bread during the supper, Jesus engaged with the apostles while they were eating, not to distract or deflect or separate them from their meal, but to contribute to it. We know the meal did not suddenly cease once Jesus broke and distributed the bread, because it is not until the next scene that the record says the supper was ended. This stage, still a little later on, is when Jesus will proceed to share out the wine. Now, 1 Corinthians 11 verse 23, Paul begins his account of the breaking of bread by firstly relating it to a momentous event from within the same 24-hour period. He says, not that it was back in the day when Jesus was arrested. He doesn't say that it was on within the 24-hour period that Jesus was tortured. He doesn't even say it was back in the day when Jesus died. He says that it was on the night Jesus was betrayed. And much like the previous scene in Matthew and Mark, Paul relates the breaking of bread scene to the betrayal, thus to the betrayer himself, and so thereby to Jesus' response, Jesus' relationship to his betrayer. Jesus had already demonstrated by table fellowship this evening his readiness, his willingness and ability to invite, accept and associate with his betrayer. Now, by giving everyone of his own bread, he has shown he is equally ready, willing and able to serve and give to his betrayer the same way as he serves and gives to the rest, without even a hint of aversion or discrimination. There might have been a hint of aversion or discrimination. Some scholar might like to conjure up such a scenario, but we don't find that in the record. Paul was reminding his readers to ponder and learn from the fact that Jesus could serve and give for the sake of a disciple whom he knows to be on the verge of a heinous and deplorable lapse of faith and commitment. And this the Lord did among other followers who not only knew by then, they knew by this time that Jesus judged one of them to be a traitor, but those disciples also saw for themselves that it made no discernible difference to how Jesus interacted with any of them. Paul reminds his readers of that interaction between Jesus and his betrayer, for by it the apostles at the supper had been shown by Jesus his model of table fellowship for them, and so by implication for all disciples. It was for their learning. It was theirs to imitate. And I don't simply mean, of course, the Corinthians to whom Paul was writing, but obviously to Christians throughout the ages. And this is why Paul tells his readers, as Luke tells his also, that Jesus said to the apostles, "Do this in remembrance of me." Now we go into the following scene, following on from the account of the bread and following on from this are four accounts of what is seemingly one and the same event, which is a serving of wine, which is in addition to the one serving with which Jesus began the meal at Luke chapter 22 verse 17. So this now is both the second and the final serving of wine that we have on record for the Last Supper. There may have been other servings of wine, but this is the second and the final serving which we have on record. The four accounts are in Matthew 26 verses 27 through 29, Mark 14 verses 23 through 25, Luke 22 at verse 20 this time, and also at 1 Corinthians 11 verse 25, I should say. 1 Corinthians 11 verse 25. And they describe what I call the sixth scene of the occasion of the Last Supper. Now, by merging the four passages together, the combined account reads something like this. After supper, after having supped, Jesus also in the same manner took a cup, the cup, and gave thanks and gave it to them, saying, "Drink of it, all of you." And they all drank it. And he said to them, "As often as you drink, do this in remembrance of me. For this is my blood, that of the covenant, that which is shed for many for the remission of sins. This cup is the new covenant in my blood, which is shed for you. But I say to you that from now on I will in no way drink of this fruit of the vine until that day when I drink it with you newly in the kingdom of my Father. Truly I tell you, I will not drink any more of the fruit of the vine at all until that day when I drink it newly in the kingdom of God." For Matthew and Mark, this is the first mention of a cup at the Last Supper. Whether they wrote a cup or the cup depends on which manuscripts you consult. Paul says the cup because accounts of the Last Supper were well known to the New Testament churches, and so being an important part of that teaching, the cup was already a familiar object in Christian law at that time. Luke says the cup because he had already introduced it as a cup back at verse 17, showing that it was the same cup used each time, which is to say the same vessel called a poterion in Greek. The obvious implication is that this cup from which the disciples first divvied out their wine before eating has since been refilled for their final draught of the evening as the supper drew to an end. We read again that Jesus took the cup, but as I explained in the last scene, this does not now mean that he received it from someone. Just as when Jesus took bread, so also here. The Greek word translated took simply means to take hold of. Regarding the cup this time, we might even say that Jesus laid claim to it before any one of the other disciples could take hold of it and help himself to the contents as he had done earlier. Luke and Paul point out that Jesus gave the wine in like manner to how he gave the bread. This means that for a second time, Jesus left the ease and comfort of his reclined position and walked around the table to serve the disciples individually and in person, this time, of course, serving wine instead of bread. Here again, Jesus took on a servant's role, as if he were a mere butler or wine waiter or kitchen hand, rather than the Christ, the Son of the living God, the Lord of lords and King of kings. Luke's purpose in emphasizing the manner of Jesus' task here at verse 20 is apparently to make an important contrast with how the same cup had been handled earlier at verse 17, when Jesus told the apostles to divide it among themselves. Now we can presume that as Jesus served the cup, he was, as always, judicious, even-handed, impartial and generous, certainly not unfair or niggardly. If his disciples were so charitable and gracious, then they too would have divvied or divided the cup up in like manner as Jesus did. But is that likely, I wonder? I suggest not. These were proud, self-absorbed men, each with a sense of superiority and maybe entitlement over his fellow disciples. This is not purely conjecture. Their self-aggrandizement did culminate in a quarrel between them as to who was the greatest. And we know this because, again, Luke made a special point of recording the fact. Frictions and tensions between the disciples are widely recorded in the Gospels. You can pick them up during your own reading of the Gospels. And they show that the verbal altercation which was to transpire in the upper room was a crisis which had been brewing since long before the meal began. Now it is possible, as many commentators confidently believe, that ever since the disciples arrived and sat down in the upper room this evening, some of them had been quietly chafing over their seating arrangements. After all, the Jews did observe a sort of hierarchy at a meal table which indicated or implied each diner's status or standing in relation to one another. This is not impossible in the case of the Last Supper. However, Jesus had clearly spoken against traditions of hierarchical and preferential positions during table fellowship, as we note at Luke 14 verse 7 and Matthew 23 verse 6. But Jesus surely knew his apostles well enough to realize that even in such a simple task as divvying up wine among themselves, their egos will have manifested somehow. So now, as Jesus serves the wine to these men in like manner to how he served the bread, with the humility and meekness of a true servant, I believe these disciples saw a noticeable contrast with themselves, and maybe they realized their own shortcomings with a sudden pang of conscience, which must have stung them in much the same way that much later Peter felt so bad and unworthy when Jesus set about to wash his feet. Luke and Paul say this was done after the supper or after having supped. These verses, plus 3 in John's Gospel, which also refer to this meal by the word supper, are why the meal came to be known as Christ's Last Supper. Luke's and Paul's remarks might just mean Jesus gave the wine to his disciples after they had eaten the broken bread, which he gave them while the wider meal was still in progress. But in the New Testament and in classical Greek, the words translated supped or supper refer to a meal. So Luke and Paul surely meant that Jesus served the wine after the whole supper had been completed. But regardless whether the word supped refers either directly to the bread Jesus distributed or generally to the meal as a whole, it actually amounts to effectively the same thing, namely that the bread and the meal were supped or dined upon without distinction, meaning the bread and the wider meal are inextricably connected and related to each other, just as they always were at a normal meal in biblical times. In fact, both explanations apply because in those days, diners would normally finish any meal by using their remaining bread to wipe or sop up leftover soft, semi-liquid or liquid foods such as juice, vinegar, oil, sauce, honey, paste, yogurt, butter or chutneys. To do it today is not at all that unusual, of course, depending on how you were raised as a child. Some parents were aghast at kids mopping up their gravy with bread. For others, it was common practice. In New Testament times, it was the standard practice at most every meal. But we do not need to think that at the Last Supper the disciples or Jesus made clean riddance of everything in front of them. The table etiquette, which is still customary in many societies today, probably dictated in ancient times that they leave something behind, uneaten, as Jesus seems to have done. Later, in fact, it would be even after Jesus washed the disciples' feet, there was still a leftover morsel on the table which Jesus gave to Judas at John 13, verse 26. Which was in part fulfillment of verse 18, where Jesus said that his betrayer is eating his bread. And even at that late stage, after so long a time as covered by Luke 22, verses 21 through 30, and John 13, verses 1 through 25, which was certainly over half an hour after supper is said to have ended, there was still a vessel with some kind of drink or condiment in it, into which Jesus dipped the morsel which he handed to Judas. Thus it was that once Jesus had taken the wine cup, he gave it to them. That is, in like manner as Jesus gave the bread to the disciples by leaving his reclined position and taking upon himself the form of a servant, so Jesus also shared out the wine. If it escapes us how remarkable this was to the apostles, realize that Jesus was doing something normally left for the household servants to do. This was not quite so lowly a role as foot washing, for example, but it was still a servile role. And in a large or wealthy household such as this, where the Last Supper is being held, serving food and drink was the role of the staff, who would normally wait on the table while the lord of the house with his family and friends ate and drank to the full. Jesus had taught this principle of meek and humble servitude many times by word and deed, and especially at Luke chapter 17, verses 7 through 10, when he asked his apostles back then, "What master has his slave come in from the day's work and tells him to recline and eat?" No, the lowly slave has to wait until he has first dutifully served the master his dinner and not expecting any thanks, and only after that can he, the slave, then eat and drink. Jesus ended that lesson by telling the apostles, "So you too, when you do all the things which are commanded you, say, 'We are unworthy slaves. We have only done what we ought to have done.'" And now at the Last Supper, the apostles must at least be a little embarrassed that their Lord and Messiah has twice now done for them what their collective consciences are probably telling them they ought to have done for him instead. Now, these men probably entered the supper feeling that such service was woman's work and beneath their dignity. They still had to learn the basics of humility and meekness in being a follower of Christ. By Jesus serving at table in the upper room, as well as washing their feet later, he showed them what these lowly aspects of his character look like at their most elementary level. Jesus gave the same lesson twice over, first in the bread, then in the wine, and doubly so for Judas, because the morsel he received before departing was most probably Jesus' own last piece of bread, soaked in wine from the bottom of the cup, the wine Jesus denied to himself, but which he gave to everyone else. After Jesus served the cup to the disciples, he pointed out that his betrayer was still with him at the table. But even though Luke chapter 22 verses 20 through 22 makes this very clear, many commentators, and perhaps even most of them, express everything from doubt to adamant unbelief that Judas, that is Judas Iscariot, partook of the bread which Jesus identified with his body. And many of them do not believe he partook of the wine identified with Jesus' blood. Yet the combined Gospels really give no grounds for any uncertainty on this matter. In response to Jesus' remark about the betrayer at the table, according to Luke chapter 22 verse 23, the apostles reacted by discussing among themselves which one of them it might be who was going to do this thing. But they would have been in no doubt if just a little earlier Christ had snubbed Judas, if Christ had denied or forbidden Judas the bread and wine. From reporting the apostles' discussion of who might betray Jesus, Luke 22 goes on to say at verse 24, "There arose also a dispute among them as to which of them was regarded as the greatest." It does not need much insight to see how the discussion must have descended into a dispute. Several indications in the Gospels of slights, umbrage, competitiveness or one-upmanship show how a quarrel between the 12 apostles will have been brewing for ages. At the supper now, not one of the other 11 could confidently say who the betrayer was, but even so, everyone would express an opinion as to who were the potential black sheep among them. And the Greek implies that this was an argument they all wanted to have out with one another. Talk of a traitor, let them voice their speculations and insinuations. These precipitated into frank criticisms and accusations, and then descended into vehement denials and blustering protests of innocence, followed by sharp rebuttals and counter-accusations. At first, not everyone would lay claim to his own greatness necessarily. Some may have taken sides to promote one of the others. But with hackles and tempers and voices all rising, each man ended up defending his own matchless commitment and allegiance to the Lord, and then asserting his own special ministry or fellowship with Christ that implied his superiority over the rest. Judas Iscariot himself, he had to join in or else draw attention to himself. And it says something for the personality of the man that even in this contentious and what must have been an inquisitorial arena where people were sort of questioning each other very sharply, Judas nonetheless kept his true disposition from being discerned by any of the others. Luke chapter 22 verses 25 through 30 proceeds immediately to recount how Jesus replied to their dispute by admonishing them to attain his own true perspective of greatness. And it is here that countless gospel commentaries and harmonies join in one accord to say Luke's record merges with John's record at chapter 13, from verses 12 through 17. Now, I happen to agree with this interlinking of Luke and John. While Jesus' words in the two passages are nowhere identical, his focus and tone are essentially the same. It's hard not to imagine Jesus saying the things recorded in Luke and John at the same time. If this is granted, then Jesus first responded to the apostles' dispute not with words at all, but by washing their feet, as recorded in John 13 verses 2 through 11. And in that case, the foot washing preceded what in Luke's record Jesus went on to say about true greatness. Although this presumed correlation of events cannot be proved indisputably or irrefutably, it does make best sense of Luke and John's accounts. The apostles' quarrel presented the perfect motive for the foot washing. The foot washing provided the perfect rebuttal to the apostles' dispute. As John Carter says in his study of John's Gospel, the story of the strife mentioned by Luke is almost essential for a complete understanding of the words of Jesus after he had washed their feet. It appears then that Luke and John recorded the same discourse Jesus gave about servitude, but that their records are from two different perspectives. In Luke's account, it is the immediate need to confront the apostles' dispute, and in John's account, it is presented as part of verse 1's broader and deeper theme of the great love with which Jesus loved his own unto the end, or to the utmost. And obviously, that would ultimately be accomplished with his death on the cross. But even here in the upper room, Jesus has extended his love to the end and to the utmost, even to such a one as his betrayer, Judas Iscariot.